My name is William Carter. I'm 68 years old and I was a gravedigger for nearly all of my adult life. I started at 23, right after returning from military service, and I never stopped. I worked for 42 years at the same municipal cemetery in Harlan County, Kentucky. It's not a famous place or a pretty one, just one of those small cemeteries, surrounded by damp hills, a dirt road and fences that are always falling over. But for more than 4 decades, it was the only thing that gave me a sense of order, of respect. I was never good with the living. The dead at least don't lie. The routine was always the same. Arrive early, review the burial schedule, clean the entrance, check if any animals had broken in overnight, then tend to the older graves, keep the stones clean, cut the taller grass. Sometimes, when the day was quiet, I would walk among the oldest graves, the ones from the 1800s, almost faded away. I always respected that place. I was never in a hurry, until the day I noticed something out of place and everything began to change. It was a Wednesday. I remember clearly because it had rained heavily earlier that week, and I needed to check if the eastern slope hadn't collapsed. The city had approved an expansion of the cemetery months earlier, and a new section was being planned. I had helped clear the land the previous summer. We marked the area, pulled out small trees, leveled the ground. There would be 24 new plots and space for a small chapel. Nothing extraordinary, just expansion. But that day when I got there, I saw something that made me stop halfway. A dark, thick brick wall, standing in the wrong place. The wall surrounded a space that simply didn't exist in the original plans. It formed a perfect rectangle, with an old cracked iron gate that led directly into a new section. That hadn't been there the week before, I was sure. I walked to the gate cautiously. It was unlocked, as if it had been waiting for me. When I stepped through, I felt a strange shift in the air. The wind stopped. The sounds around me disappeared, as if I had stepped into a windowless room. The atmosphere wasn't silent, it was suffocating. Inside the wall there were at least 20 graves, all perfectly aligned with dark, matte headstones. Each one already had a name, a date of birth, and a date of death. But the strangest part, there were no signs of digging. No disturbed earth, no records in the office, and I handled all that personally. It was impossible that burials had taken place without my knowledge. Even if I had taken a day off, someone would have told me. But I had no memory of missing work, and no one mentioned anything about new burials. It was as if the graves had appeared fully formed, as if they had grown out of the ground. I walked up to one of the stones and stared at the photo. The face in black and white was faded, almost dissolved under the glass. I didn't recognize it immediately, but something about the eyes unsettled me. Something familiar, like a face glimpsed at a burial decades ago. I walked slowly between the tombs. Different names, recent dates, yet everything looked old, as if someone had fabricated aged headstones for deaths that had happened a week ago. One of them had a date of death from the day before. I returned to the office, rifled through the past 2 months of burial records. None of those names were there. Not in the ledgers, not in the digital files. I called the city registrar's office. Nothing. Non-existent names. I asked Nancy, the lady who handled paperwork in the afternoon shift. She was just as confused, said no death certificates had been filed for those people. I started asking old colleagues, people who'd been there before me. 1 or 2 suggested it might be a restored old section. Others laughed off my concern. But I knew that part didn't belong to any plan. Not by the city, not by any living person. The next morning, the section seemed bigger. 2 new graves had appeared on the side. One of them had a lit candle, right in the center of the headstone. It was 8:30 in the morning. The sun was already up. And yet, the flame trembled steadily, as if shielded by something invisible. No one had seen it being lit. And it remained burning despite the breeze. I approached. The wax dripped slowly down the base, forming symmetrical lines, like someone had shaped them deliberately. It was white, clean, new. A chill ran up my neck. For the first time in years, I thought about leaving early, but I stayed, watching the names. One of them caught my eye, the last on the row. Carter, my last name. I looked again. The first name was different, but the discomfort remained. I closed the gate to the new section and walked away slowly. But I knew that section hadn't finished growing. I went back the next day, not out of curiosity, at least that's what I told myself, but because something about that place wouldn't let me rest. I had dreamed about it. I dreamed of the candle burning, the rusted gate, the names no one had placed there, but that were carved as if they had always been part of the cemetery. When I opened my eyes before the sun had even risen, I already knew I was going back. It wasn't a decision, it was a compulsion, as if the ground itself was pulling me. I crossed the cemetery in silence, as I always did. The older graves seemed unusually quiet, as if even they were wary of what was growing on the other side of the wall. When I reached the gate to the new section, I noticed the lock was broken, but the gate had never had a lock. I remembered that clearly. The day before, it had just been resting shut. Now there was a chain hanging loose and an open padlock lying on the ground, as if someone had tried to lock it and changed their mind. I stepped inside. The candle on the grave at the end still burned. Same height of the flame, same wax dripping at an impossible slowness. It was as if time moved differently in there, but what really held my gaze that morning were the names. I decided to write them all down. I brought my old registry notebook, the one I used when the digital system crashed, and began copying each headstone. Name, date of birth, date of death. They were all recent. From 15 days ago up to yesterday, there were 26 graves now. 2 more than the day before. No one had dug them. No one had brought any coffins, and no one who worked with me knew a thing about them. Or if they did, they weren't talking. The air in that section made me sweat even in the morning cold. The stones seemed damper than the rest of the cemetery, and each name all felt more wrong than the last. I went home at the end of that shift with the full list. I searched the county's burial records. Nothing. None of the names existed. No death certificates, no scheduled funerals. I tried the next town's registry, then the county health office. All 26 names were absent from any official system, as if they had never been born, as if they had never died. But I saw the gravestones. I saw the faces. And I wrote down those dates with my own hand. That night I sat in the kitchen with the list in front of me, under the dim glow of the table lamp. My wife was asleep. The clock made a dull ticking sound, and I stared at the names like someone looking at something ancient, yet deeply personal. One of them stood out. Robert J. Carter. Date of birth, 1911. Date of death, 1955. My heart raced. I knew that name. It was my grandfather's, but he wasn't buried there. At least, he wasn't supposed to be. Robert Carter died in a mining accident when my father was still a child. The whole town attended the funeral, or so they said, but there had never been a headstone. My father always spoke about it with unease, like he was never sure where the body ended up. When I asked, he'd say, "All I know is they made everything disappear too quickly." That had always stayed in a dark corner of my memory. But now my grandfather's name was etched into a stone that had appeared out of nowhere, in a section that wasn't supposed to exist. I went back the next morning. The stone was still there, identical, but the photograph now had details I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just an old portrait. It was an old image, yes, but the expression had changed, somehow modern, as if the photo had subtly shifted since the day before. The eyes were looking straight at me. I felt as though my grandfather was trying to tell me something. A warning? A request? I went to the office and confronted Mark, the new supervisor who had taken over after my retirement. I showed him the notebook, told him about the headstones, asked for access to the older documents. He listened in silence with a kind of calm that made my skin crawl. When I finished, he only said one thing. "You know there are things better left alone, Will." And that was it. No explanation, no denial. Just that sentence, spoken like it had been passed down for generations. That night I dreamed of the section again, but this time there was something more. I walked between the graves, and I heard names being whispered. Every time I passed a headstone, a voice murmured the name engraved on it, as if calling me to confirm, as if expecting something from me. And when I woke up, the candle was still burning, inside my house, alone, lit on the kitchen counter. I stopped counting the graves after the 30th. It was as if with each passing day a new space emerged in that section, creeping across the ground like mold behind a damp wall. No one said anything. No new staff, no funeral trucks, no visible activity. But the graves were there, growing in number as if the cemetery was conducting its own inventory of souls, one by one, in silence. Even after retiring, I kept going back. I don't know if it was stubbornness or fear of what might happen if I stopped watching. It was like keeping guard over something you didn't understand, but knew had to be contained. I tried to pretend it was routine, that I was just revisiting unfinished tasks. But deep down I knew I no longer trusted that place without my presence. And maybe, in some twisted way, it no longer trusted me outside of it either. It was on a Friday before dawn that I saw what was not meant to be seen. I arrived early that night, long before sunrise. A light drizzle fell and a low mist clung to the ground like a filthy shroud. When I turned the corner into the news section, I saw faint lights dancing among the headstones. I thought they were candles, or maybe vandals, but there was something choreographed about it, a repetitive motion, precise, like a ritual. I hid behind the maintenance shed and peeked through a crack. There were 4 men. I didn't recognize any of them. They wore long dark coats and kept their heads bowed. They carried a coffin made of raw wood, no handles, no markings. They moved slowly, as if each step followed a rhythm only they could hear. They stopped in front of one of the newly appeared graves. The pit was already open, but there was no disturbed earth around it, no shovels, no debris. It was as if the opening had formed on its own. I stayed frozen, trying to control my breathing. The darkness shielded me, but not enough to hide the shaking in my hands. They slid the coffin into the grave with impossible coordination. No sound, no impact. And when they began to cover it, they didn't use soil. They used dust. A fine grey powder they pulled from dark sacks slung over their shoulders. They spread it with bare hands, as if sealing something sacred or cursed. When they were done, they lit a candle at the center of the stone. The flame caught instantly, despite the drizzle. And then they left, unhurried, soundless. I stood there frozen until the sun rose. The next morning I went straight to that grave. The name inscribed was Eli Barrow, born 1933, died 2023. No record, not digital, not physical. The photo on the oval marble frame was so worn that the face was barely recognizable. Just the outline of a beard, a shadow of sunken eyes. But the strangest thing was the sound. There was a low hum coming from the grave. A deep, constant tone, like something breathing beneath the earth. I touched the surface of the headstone. It was warm, warm like an engine, warm like a living body. I told Mark what I saw, or tried to. He wasn't surprised. He just looked at me like someone who knows you've already seen too much. He said the cemetery sometimes had stories that weren't meant to be understood, that I should stop, that the best thing would be to move on, to forget. But I couldn't forget, and I couldn't stop. In the following days, the burials continued, always at night, always with those men, always with nameless coffins, no shovels, no dirt, just the dust and the candles. One night, I found the courage to wait. I stayed in the old section, crouched behind an ancient tombstone, watching from afar. I saw them arrive with another coffin, but something was different. The coffin fell. It hit the ground. One end burst open from the impact, and that's when I saw it. It was empty, completely empty. No body, no sheet, no padding, just a folded cloth at the bottom like part of a set. And still, they buried it the same way, with the same reverence, the same ritual, empty coffins, and headstones with names. It was as if that cemetery wasn't burying bodies, but stories, lives no one had lived, people no one had known, or worse, people who hadn't been born yet. And that night, when I returned to the entrance of the new section, there was a single headstone facing me, alone, with my name at the top. No dates, no photo, just the stone raw, waiting, like a blank page about to be written. After that night, after seeing the empty coffin buried as if it held a king, I should have walked away. Any man with common sense would have. But when you've spent your life among the dead, your sense of normal changes. And the truth is, I was already in too deep. Part of me, a part I don't like to admit, wanted to understand, wanted to see how far it would go. I spent the next few days watching the new section from a distance, not entering, not touching, just observing. It grew slowly, not in size, in presence. It began to infect the rest of the cemetery, silently. New employees seemed to avoid it, even without realizing. None of them cleaned that area. None mowed the grass. The gardeners veered their carts without thinking, as if the place existed, but wasn't meant to be touched. It was on a Monday around 5 in the afternoon when I saw the first stain. It was at the corner of the headstone belonging to the man named Eli Barrow. the same grave I had witnessed being buried with grey dust. A thin, dark line was trickling from the base. I thought it was rust or mud, runoff from the rain the night before. I knelt down with some effort, touched the edge of the stone with a handkerchief, and brought it to my nose. Blood. It wasn't wet earth. It was blood. Dry, dense, dark. The handkerchief trembled in my hand. I looked around, hoping someone would be there to confirm the absurd thing I was seeing, but the cemetery was empty, silent. I'd seen bodies leak fluids weeks after burial, when decomposition runs its course. I'd dealt with poorly sealed graves. But this was something else. The blood wasn't coming from below. It was rising. For the next few hours, I went from grave to grave, as far as my knees would let me. Almost half of the headstones in the new section were the same. Threads of dried blood running down their sides, some so thin they looked painted on, others more visible, staining the marble around them. It was as if each grave was weeping at the corners. I went home and didn't say a word to my wife. I sat on the porch staring at the gravel road, listening to the crickets. I tried to write in my notebook what I had seen, but the words seemed to slip away, as if the paper itself rejected the account. The ink bled, the letters smudged. It was like trying to hold a nightmare with bare hands. The next day, I gave in. I dug. I chose the newest grave. It had no name, just a small metal plate labeled 14506. No flowers, no photograph, no sign anyone had visited. I used my old tools still stored in the back of the shed. I started slowly. The soil was too loose, light, warm, and there was no concrete layer beneath the surface, as was standard in regular burials. Just dust, that same grey dust, and beneath it, fabric, a thin translucent cloth, like mourning veil. I lifted the cloth with the spade. Beneath it, there was no coffin. There was a kind of skeletal structure, but not like any human skeleton. The bones were arranged incorrectly, as if someone had tried to reconstruct a body from memory, and failed. Ribs, where arms should be. A skull that looked elongated, cracked, and in the center of the chest, embedded deep into the bone, was a copper medallion, etched by hand with my surname, Carter. The nausea hit me all at once. I vomited right there, beside the open grave, and nearly collapsed into it. I covered everything back up as best I could, my hands trembling, and stumbled away. I passed through the old section like a man walking through a desecrated temple, avoiding eye contact with the other graves, as if they could see what I had done. That night I heard knocks on my door, 3 short exact taps, the kind of sound you never forget. When I opened it, no one was there, but on the porch mat, a small iron cross, and tied to it with wire, a note. Do not dig again. I spent the next 2 days at home trying to convince myself that there had to be an explanation. It could have been hallucination, stress, or some illness hiding in me for years. My wife noticed my silence but didn't ask. She'd learned over time that certain silences come from places too deep to reach with words. Still, for the first time since I retired, I thought about leaving the county, going to my sister's place in Ashland, spending some time far from here, breathing air that didn't smell of overturned soil. But it was too late. Friday morning, before the sun rose, I went to the cemetery. Something was pushing me. Not fear, certainty. The certainty that this was reaching an end one way or another. I crossed the gates without looking to either side. The ground was blanketed with thick fog, as if the clouds had descended and knelt there. And even before I saw it, I already knew what was waiting for me. The new headstone was in the most recent row, right at the center of the section. It was different from the others. Not dark marble, not pale granite. It was made of something I didn't recognize at first, something between polished bone and aged wax. A barely perceptible sheen coated its surface, and at the top, perfectly carved, was my name, William James Carter, born in 1955, died in 2024. The date was that very day. I couldn't move for several seconds, my body locked in place, as if the headstone had caught me in an invisible gaze. I stepped forward slowly, each footfall heavier than the last. The photo in the oval frame was me, but not a version of me I remembered. I was older, thinner, unshaven. My eyes were sunken. It was a version of me that didn't yet exist, but might soon. The ground around the headstone was dry, but moisture rose from beneath it, as if something beneath the soil was breathing. And there was more. Behind the stone, driven into the earth with mathematical precision, was a coffin. A coffin that hadn't been there the day before, with my name branded into the lid, burned in with iron. My hand trembled as I touched the wood. It was warm. The surface pulsed, barely but undeniably, like the coffin was waiting. I sat on the nearest stone bench, the bench where years ago I used to see families weep while I dug, where children left crooked flowers and torn notes, where old men sat in silence before names only they remembered. I looked at my headstone and I understood. The new section wasn't an extension of the cemetery. It was a mirror, not a mirror of glass, but of fate, of transition. Every grave there wasn't for someone who had died, but for someone who would die. It was a map of futures, a cemetery of events, burials that came before death, names that surfaced before the final breath. It was a place where endings arrived early. I went home that day. I told no one. What difference would it make? What explanation could possibly fit in words? I had dinner with my wife, spoke little, stared out the window for hours until the sky lost all its color. When I went to bed, I placed my notebook on the dresser. I wrote a single sentence. The headstone is already there. I woke at 2:43 a.m. to the sound of the back door creaking open. I went downstairs in silence. There was no wind, no light, just the presence of the cemetery inside me like a call echoing without sound. I walked to the porch. The fog had returned, thicker than ever, and in the middle of it, 3 men were waiting. They were the same ones I had seen on previous nights, the ones who buried empty coffins. But this time there was no coffin. There was only a silk rope hanging from the arm of one of them, and a copper medallion spinning in the hand of another. I didn't run, I didn't fight, I didn't cry. I walked with them in silence. When we passed through the cemetery gate, the candles in the new section were already lit, like an inverted procession, and my headstone now had the full date. I think I'm writing this just to leave a record, in case someone finds it, in case someone sees my name and wonders. Don't look for explanations, don't try to understand. Just know that not every burial starts with a body. Sometimes it starts with a name, and mine was already there. Story 2. My name is Thomas Grady. I'm 71 years old, and for over 4 decades, I was a gravedigger in the same cemetery in a forgotten little town in southern Indiana called Larch Hollow. Most people have never heard of it, and honestly I think that's for the best. The town is small, old, steeped in fog and silence, a place where time moves slowly, as if afraid to disturb the dead. I started working at the municipal cemetery when I was 28. I was young but already weary of the world. I never took to offices or small talk. I liked simple, straightforward work, digging, burying, keeping the place in order. The dead gave me more peace than the living. They never asked for too much. They never lied. I took care of them, and for a long time I thought that was all I needed to understand. But that was before the headstone. I don't know exactly when I started to notice. Maybe it was after a particularly dry summer when I spent weeks cleaning moss and dust off the oldest graves. The West Wing was always the oldest part of the cemetery, where the town's first founders rest. There, almost every headstone is worn, cracked, eaten away by 100 winters' rain. But one stood out. It wasn't new or recent. It was darkened stone with no visible inscriptions. No date, no name, no symbol. Just a large, slightly tilted slab, leaning to the left, with faint signs of aging, but clean. Always clean. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe a mysterious visitor tended to it, someone who came only at dawn, unidentified. But the cemetery gates are locked at night. I did the rounds myself. No one had been there. No one I could see. I tried to recall if I'd ever buried anyone in that spot, but nothing came to mind. I checked the records, notebooks and files going back to the 1940s. Nothing. No burial listed for that exact plot. The grave number was on the map, but it was blank, as if it was a reserved space that was never used. I returned to it days later out of curiosity, and there it was, the stone, clean. While leaves piled up around it, branches fell, and time did its work, it remained untouched. Not a spider web. Not a speck of dust. Not a scratch. I found it odd, but let it pass. I've seen worse in cemeteries. Mixed up graves, duplicate bones, coffins arriving with the wrong tags. All human error. All explainable. But that stone, it seemed to defy the usual rules of the place. And more than that, it unsettled me in a strange way, as if it knew I was there, as if it was waiting for me. I started watching it closely. Every morning, on my first round, I'd go to it. I'd place my palm on the stone, check the edges. Never once did I find signs of cleaning, no trace of a brush, cloth, or product. Yet the surface remained smooth, cold, clean, as if it had been freshly placed, though its base was fused to the ground with decades of roots and cement. During the fall, I tested it. I deliberately placed a few leaves on it during my shift. 3 dry oak leaves. The next day, they were gone. Not around it, just gone. I tried again, sprinkling some dirt on the base. The next day it was clean, the stone, and wouldn't allow filth. And then I started having dreams, nothing too clear, fragments. Me walking among the graves, always stopping at that headstone. Sometimes it called to me, sometimes there were voices in the background, but I couldn't make them out. Just a growing sense that the stone wanted to be read, or that soon it would have something to show me. It was early November during my early morning round when I noticed the first change. The stone was slightly different. Its tilt seemed less pronounced, the surface more polished, and for a split second I swear I saw traces of something etched on it, as if someone had started carving a name and stopped before finishing. I knelt down, ran my fingers carefully over it, and felt faint grooves beneath the surface, nothing visible to the naked eye. But they were there, like an incomplete inscription, like a warning. I returned every day after that, anxious, tense, like someone who knows something's coming but doesn't know when. Until one cloudy morning, with the ground still damp from dew, the stone finally revealed a name. And it wasn't mine, yet. The name appeared without sound, without announcement, without any sign of human intervention. When I arrived that morning, with the fog still creeping among the graves and the cold air biting my fingers, it was there, carved perfectly. Letters in relief, as if etched by someone who knew every curve of the stone. Daniel Moore, born 1948, died 2006. I froze. Daniel Moore. It wasn't just any name. I knew this man, or rather, I had known him. He was one of the few who actually talked to me decades ago, when I was new to the job and hadn't yet developed the heavy silence that comes with time. He owned a lumberyard in town. A lot of people didn't like him, but I never had issues. He died of cancer, if I recall correctly. Buried in 2006. I remembered clearly because I dug the grave that day in the north wing. I knew exactly where he was buried, and it wasn't there. His name simply didn't belong to that unmarked tomb, that headstone that had been a silent enigma for years. But now it spoke. It screamed. I ran back to the tool shed, pulled out the old logbook, checked the burial records. There it was. Daniel Moore. Lot 13A, North Wing. Far from the West Wing, where that mysterious stone had stood for decades before his death. I returned to the headstone several times that day. I touched it, as if that would help me understand. I tried scraping, rubbing, cleaning, to see if it was some hallucination. But the name was there, solid, real, and worse, it looked newer than any other inscription in the cemetery. The stone around it had the same ancient wear, but the name gleamed in the dim morning light, as if it had been placed there, that very night. The next morning I returned early. Anxiety gnawed at me, and to my shock, the name had changed. Now it read Ellen Whitaker, born 1939, died 2001. Again, I recognized it. Ellen had been a school teacher in Larch Hollow for over 30 years. She taught generations of children. I'd seen her often visiting her husband's grave. When she died, I was there too. I remember how her husband was buried in the central wing, and how she was laid to rest beside him, with silk flowers her daughter brought from out of state. But now, her name was on that same cursed headstone, the same one that, the day before, bore Daniel Moore's name. The grave remained sealed. No signs of digging. Nothing had been disturbed in the soil. No burial had taken place there. It was as if the tomb was being used by names. I spent the next few days obsessed. I started documenting everything, every name, every date. I took photos with my old digital camera, printed copies, marked on the cemetery map where the real bodies were buried, and compared them to the headstone that now behaved like a blackboard from beyond. Each dawn a new name, all real dead people, all buried elsewhere, all people I'd known at some point in my life, old townsfolk, forgotten names. people who'd passed by me in silence. One by one they appeared and vanished the next day, replaced by another. Worse still, the names appeared in descending order. The first ones had died in the 2000s, then came names with death dates in the 90s, then the 80s. It was as if the stone was moving backward in time. I witnessed the name of William Harrow died 1982, then Ruth Langdon died 1974. People buried decades ago, but still alive in my memory. Blurred faces, old voices. Each name a knife, a memory, an open wound. I showed everything to Mark, the new maintenance technician. He looked at the photos with a mix of skepticism and unease. He said it could be vandalism or a sick prank, but no one had access to the cemetery at night, and no other headstone had been touched. That's when the nightmares started. Nightmares where I stood before the headstone, but it no longer bore names. It bore reflections, my face, my name, carved calmly, firmly, with purpose. And upon waking, I felt more and more that the moment was approaching, as if the stone was preparing, as if it was choosing. It took me a few days to realize. At first, the names appearing on that headstone were from long ago. People I'd buried myself, decades back. It was like flipping through a decrepit photo album, page by page, face by face. But then something shifted. The pattern broke. The stone, which had seemed to sink backward in time like a river flowing in reverse, suddenly leapt forward. The name appeared on a Tuesday. I remember it clearly. The sun hadn't yet broken through the fog when I turned the corner into the west wing and saw the new name etched on the stone. George H. Pendleton, born 1950, died 2024. I stopped dead. I've known George since we were boys. He never left town. Worked as an electrician for 40 years, a quiet, practical man, good for a chat if you knew how to draw him out. He was still alive. I'd seen him the previous weekend at the corner store, grumbling about the price of coffee and laughing with the cashier. He was healthy, strong and stubborn as ever, and now his name was carved there. I stared at the headstone for long minutes, waiting for the name to vanish, for it to be a hallucination, a trick of light, an absurd prank by some lunatic. But it wasn't. The name was there as real as any other. That afternoon I went to George's house, knocked on the door. He greeted me with that same weathered face, like he'd woken up earlier than he should have every day of his life. Offered me coffee and we sat on the porch. I tried to act normal, talked about old times, how the town always seemed the same. Then I asked how he was feeling. He shrugged. Aches here and there, but nothing that'll kill me anytime soon, he said, laughing. I didn't know how to respond. I just smiled and left, swallowing hard. 2 days later, George fell down the basement stairs, hit his head, brain hemorrhage, dead before he reached the hospital. The headstone didn't lie. After him, more names came, living people. Folks I still saw on the streets, at the butcher, the pharmacy, the park benches where retirees shoot the breeze. Names that were upright one day, and the next, memories carved in stone. Each name that appeared, I wrote down. I'd rush to the person, try to warn them, but the words slipped away. How do you explain a headstone that predicts deaths? How do you not sound insane? By the third death, I saw the cycle. The name appeared. Within 3 days, the person died. Always in trivial accidents, natural causes, no signs of violence or conspiracy, as if the world just accepted it. I started photographing the headstone every day, printing, filing, building a small dossier. But the more evidence I gathered, the more isolated I felt. No one wanted to listen. Not Mark, not my wife, not the priest, not the retired sheriff I fished with on Sunday mornings. They all said I was getting old, tired, haunted by a lifetime of grief among the dead. Until I saw Alice's name, Alice Hastings. She was a clerk at the town library, mid-30s, always with a polite smile, the kind of person who remembers your name even if you've only been there once. She'd offer me tea sometimes when I went to check old newspapers against the cemetery records. When I saw her name carved on the stone, I felt a chill inside. The next morning, I went straight to the library. She was there, smiling, organizing books in the local history section. "Thomas, it's been a while since you stopped by," she said, with her usual warmth. I tried to warn her, not the way I wanted. The words wouldn't come. I could only ask how she was, if she was sleeping well, if she felt anything strange. She looked at me lightly and said, "Everything's fine, why?" And in that moment I understood. The stone wasn't a warning, it was a sentence. Alice died 2 days later. A sudden heart attack at home alone. She was only 34. That's when I realized running, warning, praying, it was pointless. The names didn't appear to be avoided. They appeared because what had to happen had already been decided. That night I woke up sweating. I dreamed of the headstone, but it bore no name. It was covered in mirrors, and in them I saw faces, hundreds, and in every one, mine. I knew this moment would come. From the first name that appeared on that cursed headstone, from the first reflection I saw when it was still silent, I knew. The stone didn't choose at random. It was closing in, name by name, face by face, circling tighter around me. And when it stopped circling, it would carve something that couldn't be undone. The morning I saw my wife's name on that stone, the world seemed to stop. No wind, no sound. Even the birds, which usually peck at the ground around the graves at dawn, were gone. Margaret Evelyn Grady, born 1957, died 2024. The name was complete. The date was exact. Today's. My heart pounded so hard I thought I'd die right there, collapse to my knees in the damp mud, and become another victim of a name that appeared too soon. Margaret was my anchor. The only reason I never sank into the voids this job carves into a man. She was my living memory, my home, my laughter after hard burials, my sanity. And now, she was written there, cold, irreversible. I ran home like a fugitive, burst through the back door, still with dirt on my boots. Margaret was in the kitchen, as always, making tea with the calm hands of someone who'd never known despair. When she saw me, shaking, sweating, pale, she dropped everything and came to me. I didn't know how to say it. I just held her shoulders and stared into her eyes, like I was trying to keep her soul inside her body. "Are you okay?" she asked, worried. "Don't leave the house today," was all I could say. She frowned, expecting a rational explanation, but there wasn't one. I tried to make something up, said I'd had a bad dream, that the weather felt off, that I sensed something could happen. She laughed and tried to calm me, as she always did, but I didn't smile back. I stayed there, all morning, sitting by the door, waiting. At 2:32 p.m. the phone rang. She answered. It was her sister asking if she could stop by their parents' house to pick up a photo album. Margaret said yes, said she'd be back soon. I begged, pleaded, implored her not to go. Said I'd go in her place, said it could be anyone else any other day, but she looked at me with pity and with love. "Thomas, I'll be back in half an hour, dear." She kissed my forehead and left. She never came back. The police said it was a stupid accident. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car from the side. She died instantly, felt no pain. It was all very quick, but I felt it. I felt every second. When I went to the morgue to identify her body, she looked like she was just sleeping. Her face serene, no trace of suffering. The same expression she had on Saturday mornings, reading a book on the couch as her tea went cold. I held her, let myself cry only there. After that, I couldn't anymore. The next day, the headstone in the West Wing already had another name, as if Margaret had never been there, as if the tomb was ready for the next in line. But I couldn't pretend I didn't see. That I didn't understand. The stone was closing in on me. 3 nights later, I dreamed of the cemetery, but it wasn't quite as it is. It was darker, deeper, like it was made of underground layers I'd never explored. I walked through empty paths, and every headstone bore my name, each with a different date, one for every version of me that didn't take a certain path, one for every moment I could have died, but didn't. And at the center of it all, there it was, the stone, massive, alive, pulsing. My name flashing like a warning. When I woke, the note Margaret had left on the fridge, back in half an hour, was gone. In its place was an old yellowed piece of paper with a single handwritten line. "You can't bury time." It had been 4 days since Margaret was buried. I prepared the grave myself. Even retired, I asked for permission. No one stopped me. The town officials looked at me with pity, with care, as if I were dirty glass about to shatter, but they let me dig. And I did it as I always had. Straight, precise, silent, as if it were just another task. But I knew it was the last thing still tying me to this world. Since the accident, I hadn't slept, not with my eyes closed. The house felt too big. The hallways echoed my name. The kettle whistled on its own at night. And every day at the same time, someone knocked once on the front door. When I opened it, no one was there. On the 5th day, I returned to the cemetery, not to work, not to patrol. I went because the stone was calling me. I felt it in my chest, my throat, my bones, like a fever that doesn't burn but weakens. I already knew what I'd find. I just needed to confirm, to see it with my own eyes. The morning was grey, the sky heavy. Dry leaves crunched under my steps like tiny bones. I crossed the iron gates and went straight to the west wing. The fog was thicker there, as it always was. The headstone was waiting for me. My name was carved perfectly. Thomas Grady, born 1953, died 2024. The date was tomorrow. I stared for a long time. The stone seemed to breathe. Every time I blinked, the letter's relief seemed to deepen. The photo in the frame showed my face, not from the past, not from now, but something in between. A version of me a few days ahead, more worn, lighter, as if the weight was about to lift from my shoulders. I sat on the bench nearby, the same one where I'd seen Margaret wave to me dozens of times, where we'd left flowers for acquaintances no one else visited. I sat there and waited for something to touch me, a sign, a whisper, but there was nothing. That night, I closed up the house for the last time, turned off the power, shut the windows, packed the photos. I wrote a letter to my sister in Ohio, explaining that whatever was happening couldn't be stopped, and that I didn't want anyone to try. I lay on the couch, the radio on with a soft static hum. A candle's flame flickered on the coffee table. I'd lit it without thinking. A habit, maybe. Something we inherit from the dead, without knowing. I fell asleep and dreamed of the cemetery. But this time it wasn't like the other dreams. It was a replay of the first day. The day I started working there, still young, shovel in hand, fear in my heart. The sky was the same, the earth lighter, and in the distance I saw the stone. Not alone, but multiplied. 100, 1,000 versions of it, each with names that didn't yet exist, each waiting. I woke before dawn, got up slowly, put on my work clothes one last time, flannel shirt, boots, gloves, grabbed the flashlight and walked. The town was asleep. Only the cemetery was awake. As I passed through the gate, I noticed something different. The fog had lifted. The breeze was gentle. The silence welcoming. The headstone with my name was still there. But now, the grave was open. The earth dug with the precision only my hands knew. No shovel, no wheel marks. But that grave was made as I made them, with patience, respect, symmetry. It was my work. It was my tomb. I climbed down slowly. Each step sank the sounds around me a little more. When I reached the bottom, the air was cool, almost sweet. And there, in the center of the grave, was just a pillow, white, clean, and on it, a letter. My fingers shook as I opened it. It was written in Margaret's handwriting. "You dug for so many. Now it's your turn to rest. I'm waiting." I closed my eyes, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. Story 3. My name is Robert Holden. I'm 66 years old. I worked as a gravedigger in Lawrence County, deep in Missouri, for over 40 years. When I retired, people said I should write a book about everything I'd seen in that place. Missing folks who returned only to be buried, coffins arriving with 2 bodies, graves opened from the inside, things like that. But what I'm about to tell you, it's not a story for a book. It's the kind of thing you only share when you start feeling your own time running short. It was October 2008. Mid-afternoon, I got a call at the cemetery office. The line was staticky, crackling, like it was coming from far away, but the voice sounded too close. A man asked if the cemetery still did private burials. I said yes, depending on the time and paperwork. He went quiet for a few seconds, then said, "We want the burial at midnight in the family's name." I thought it was a prank. Most burials happen in the morning or early afternoon. At night, only with a court order or special circumstances. But the man on the phone seemed to know this. He was direct. "We'll pay up front, in cash. No death certificate, no funeral home, just you and the dirt." I asked for the name of the deceased. He replied, "The name doesn't matter. The coffin is sealed." I pressed for more details, as was my duty. He refused, said they'd be at the main gate at 11:45 p.m. and hung up. I considered saying no, but something about his tone unsettled me. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't urgent. It was just certain. Like I was already fated to dig that grave before I even picked up the phone. I talked to the administrator, explained it was an unusual request but paid. He approved as long as it was discreet. No public fuss. And I had to log the details in the manual register, the one we used when the electronic systems failed. I went through the rest of the day as usual, but the feeling wouldn't leave me, like the night was gearing up for something. When the sky darkened, I went to the south wing of the cemetery, the most isolated part near the woods. I prepared the ground, marked the grave, left the shovel ready. At 11:30 p.m., I returned to the gate. They arrived on time. A black vintage car, big with yellow headlights, and a body that looked more matte than dirty. One of those models you haven't seen in decades. A Packard, maybe. I couldn't tell the exact year, but it felt like it came from another time. 3 people stepped out. An older man in a hat and overcoat, a pale woman with a sharp face, wearing a long dress and gloves, and a young man with downcast eyes, carrying the coffin with surprising ease. None of them spoke. They moved in sync like they'd rehearsed it. The coffin was plain, dark wood, unmarked, but what caught my attention was its weight, or lack of it. When I helped position it at the edge of the grave, it felt almost weightless. Too light, even for a small body. The woman pulled an envelope from her coat and handed it to me. Cash. Old bills, in good condition but with a musty smell. Notes that hadn't circulated in years, pre-1970s dollars, counted precisely, and not a word. The man just nodded, as if that sealed the deal. No tears, no crosses, no prayers. On impulse, I asked, "What name should I put in the register?" The man stared at me for a long moment, then said, "Don't write anything. He's already been buried once." They turned and walked back to the car. None of them looked back. The Packard glided down the dirt road, not kicking up a speck of dust. In seconds, the night swallowed it whole. I buried the coffin as they asked. The soil felt easier to dig than usual, like the grave was already half prepared. When I finished, I stood there for a few minutes. The candle I'd left at the grave's edge flickered, but didn't go out, despite the wind. The next morning, I wrote in the register, "Burial performed at midnight, no name, unidentified family, payment in cash." I left the lot number blank. I didn't sign it, because deep down I knew this wasn't a normal burial. And that family, they weren't from here. I stayed up that night, sitting on the cemetery's back porch, staring at the dark sky like it might give me answers. The wall clock read 3:30 a.m. when I realized I was still holding the envelope. The bills felt heavy in my hand, not from their value, but from their age. The texture, the color, the smell, they were too old. Some from the 1950s, others even older, one with a president's face from before Roosevelt, all in perfect condition. No bank in 2008 would take them without raising an eyebrow. No regular person would carry this as pocket change, but that wasn't all that bothered me. I went back to the grave before dawn. The ground was still damp from the last rain, but the grave, it didn't look fresh. The dirt was too settled, firm, like decades had pressed it down, not hours. That shook me, deeply. I started thinking about the coffin. When you carry a coffin, the body always gives a sign. Even if the deceased is light, a child, a teenager, someone thin, the weight is dense. The inertia of rigor mortis, the muffled creak of wood, it always betrays something real inside. But that one had no weight. The young man carried it with an almost theatrical ease. When I lifted the other end, it felt like an empty crate. No shift of air, no imbalance, nothing. The next night, I returned to the grave with a flashlight. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe tracks, marks, some mistake proving it was a dream or a sick prank, but there was nothing. The headstone, if you could call it that, was makeshift. A dark plank stuck upright, no inscription, no symbol, just a small iron nail at the top with a black cloth tied to it fluttering in the wind. I smelled something strange that night, like hot metal or oxidized blood. Faint, but there. An odor coming from the earth. Not the surrounding ground, but just that spot. On the third day, I went into town to track the car. Asked at the gas station on the highway, then the small hotel on Main Street. Gave a description. Old black car, maybe a Packard, 3 passengers, a woman, 2 men. No one had seen it. No one had passed through that night. The gas station owner swore the gate was locked since 10 p.m. The hotel said there'd been no bookings for 3 days. I asked the police. They said no reports of nighttime activity, no accidents, no calls. I thought about checking security cameras, but that part of town barely had streetlights. It was an old road, no traffic lights, no cameras. The only real light came from my cemetery. So I tried another angle. I talked to the parish priest, wanted to know if anyone had mentioned a recent burial, a mass, a private wake. He said there were no recorded ceremonies. When I mentioned the family's name, what I thought I'd heard on the phone, maybe Warwick or Wallach, the priest froze for a moment. He said that name was in the parish's oldest records. A family from the 19th century, declared extinct. Their house burned down in 1893. All the bodies were buried in my cemetery. My legs shook as I returned to the cemetery. In the register, I looked up the dates. There they were. Wallach family, burials in 1893. South wing, lots 12 to 17. 6 bodies, 3 adults, 3 children, all buried on the same day. I ran to the south wing, found the headstones, covered in moss, cracked by time. But the names were still there, and the dates matched. Then I realized the grave I dug that midnight in October was right next to lot 17, where, according to the book, there was a 7th grave, marked as reserved, never filled. But now, it was occupied, and no one, not time, not the records, knew or wanted to say who was there. I tried to do the right thing. Despite the strangeness of that burial, the absurd timing, the family dressed like they stepped out of an old photograph, the outdated money, the weightless coffin, I still tried to keep the paperwork alive. I noted what I could in the register: time, date, approximate grave location. I wrote in pencil, not to make it official right away, but after that visit to the priest, after learning the family was listed as deceased in 1893, I started wondering if that burial was just a performance, or worse, a repetition. The next day I went to the county clerk's office to register the death. Even without the original certificate, something I never should have done, I tried to justify it as a private family burial, paid separately with pending documents. The clerk, a guy named Lou Hastings, looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Name of the deceased?" he asked. I hesitated, then said, "Wasn't provided." He stared like I'd told a bad joke. Asked if I wanted to be arrested for falsifying records. I just asked him to open a temporary file and leave it pending until the family showed up. He agreed, grudgingly, and created a record. Number 6448, dated October 18th, 2008. No name, no medical details, unknown origin. He said it'd stay on file for 30 days. After that, it'd be discarded. He handed me a receipt, and that paper, to this day, is all that remains of that night. For 3 weeks I returned to the cemetery every day, expecting to see the car again, or someone from the family, or at least get a call, a correction, something. But there was nothing. No follow-up, no contact. The road stayed empty every night, and the makeshift headstone stayed there, nameless, dateless, with the iron nail rusting more each day. On the 31st day I went back to the clerk's office, asked to check record 6448. The new clerk found nothing. Said the number didn't exist in any system. Asked if I was sure it was filed there. I showed the receipt. He examined it, turned it over, held it to the light. Said the letterhead looked authentic, but the number didn't exist anymore. I went home with a weight in my chest, opened the cemetery's register, the one I'd written in myself, flipped to the page where I'd noted the midnight burial. But now, it was blank. The space I'd left intentionally unfinished looked like it had never been touched. No trace of pencil, no mark of pressure. Like time had erased what my memory insisted on keeping. I tried to convince myself it was my mistake. Maybe I wrote it elsewhere. Maybe I forgot to log it. But I knew better. I remembered every word, every number, every hesitant stroke. And now, nothing. That's when I started noticing other things. The key to the tool shed disappeared for 2 nights and reappeared in my coat pocket. The shovel I used that night ended up in the chicken coop behind the storage, with no one having been there. And the candles on the chapel altar, lit only on All Souls' Day, were burning when I arrived one morning. No one had been there. I talked to the administrator, asked if anyone else had touched the records. He said no, that no one went in there but me. When I mentioned the burial, he frowned and said, "What burial? We didn't have any off schedule this month." I asked to see the gate cameras. He said they'd been offline since September, wiring issues. At that point, I started wondering if it was all in my head. Maybe I'd dreamed it. Maybe it was another echo of unresolved grief from all the times I buried strangers, abandoned, forgotten. But then, I got a letter. It was in my tool locker. Folded, no sender. My name written in bold letters on the front. Inside, just one line. What's buried without a name can't be forgotten, but it can't be found either. No signature, no explanation, just the same smell of old paper, and a message that felt more like a warning. In early November, nearly a month after that burial, I thought about quitting everything. I figured I was too old, too paranoid. Things didn't make sense like they used to. The register seemed to betray me. The memory of the burial haunted me even when I tried to ignore it. And that letter with no sender, I locked it in a drawer and decided I wouldn't talk about it with anyone. Sometimes silence is the only way to hold on to sanity. Then I got a visit from a man from the state prosecutor's office. His name was Joseph Carr, an investigator of mortuary records. Said he was there about an administrative request for exhumation, but didn't say who made it. I found it odd. In the cemetery, exhumations need explicit family authorization, and in this case, there was no family, at least none that officially existed. When I asked which grave was targeted, he just pointed to the south wing. Lot 18, he said. It was exactly the grave I'd dug that midnight in October. My blood ran cold. There was no way that number was in any file. I hadn't written it anywhere, and yet, someone, somewhere, knew exactly which grave to open. I tried to argue. Said there might be a mistake, that the grave didn't formally exist, but the court order was there, signed, dated, and my name listed as a witness to the exhumation. The next day at 8 a.m., I prepared for the opening. I didn't call anyone but Carr. He'd insisted on absolute discretion. Better if no one knows what's found. That felt less like legal caution and more like fear. The dirt gave way with absurd ease. Like the first time. No resistance. Like digging sand. When the shovel hit the coffin, the sound was dry, unsoaked wood. No sign of water damage despite last month's rains. We opened it together, wordlessly. The coffin was intact. The wood looked treated, though never varnished. And then we saw the body. It was a man looking 40 to 50 years old, dressed in old but pristine clothes. A dark suit buttoned to the collar with a folded white handkerchief in the pocket. Polished shoes, hands crossed over his chest. The skin pale, firm. No blemishes, no signs of decay, like he'd been buried hours ago, but he'd been there for at least 30 days. His face wasn't familiar, but something about it, the sharp jaw, the half-closed eyes, the outdated haircut, reminded me of someone. Not a living person, but an old portrait, like a figure from a 19th century photograph. Then I remembered the parish records, the photos the priest had shown me, and the faces of the family who came to the cemetery that night. It was him, the same face as the man who drove the vintage car, the same one who handed me the envelope, the same one who'd said, "He's already been buried once." Carr stayed silent for a long time, then asked, "Did you know this guy?" I said no. I lied. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain that the man lying there was the same one who paid me to bury him, that he was dead and alive at the same time, that his presence there defied every timeline, every logic? Carr photographed the body, took notes. Then, as if something stopped him from going further, he ordered the coffin closed, told me to rebury it right there, but this time with an identifier. Put a number, any number. We'll send a temporary marker later. I chose the number 0. That night I tried to review the exhumation protocol to see who'd requested it, but the prosecutor's office denied any record, said the name Joseph Carr hadn't been in their system since 1991, that he'd retired and died 2 years later. Since then, the grave has been just another among many, but some nights when I pass by, I notice something off. The ground seems to pulse. The candles I left unlit burn on their own, and sometimes when I'm leaving, I hear something that isn't the wind, a slow breath like someone waiting, inside the grave. 15 years have passed. Sometimes I think it was all the delusion of a lonely old man, someone who spent too long among the dead. But then comes the smell, that same metallic odor I caught on the first day. Faint, but there, like rusting air. Every time I smell it, it takes me back to that midnight in October 2008, to the weightless coffin, the vanished certificate, the body that didn't rot. I kept working at the cemetery for 6 more years after that. When I retired, I asked to stay in the little house out back. It was my right, per the contract. The new gravedigger is younger, doesn't ask much, and maybe that's for the best. But I never really left, and now I know why. On the night of October 18th, 2023, the gate intercom buzzed at 11:45 p.m. The night guard called me on the radio, said a car wanted to come in, a black vintage car. Looked like something from an old movie, he said. No visit was scheduled. When I asked if the driver said anything, the guard just replied, "He asked for you," said it was time for the second burial. I knew instantly. I grabbed my flashlight, put on my old canvas coat and went to the gate. When I got there, I saw the car parked in the exact same spot as 15 years ago. Same model, same pristine condition, like it rolled off the factory line yesterday. And inside were them, the 3 passengers. Same faces, same suit, same empty gaze. The woman in the back seat looked at me calmly, smiled. It was the same quiet smile from 2008, a smile that didn't belong to this decade or any living decade. The driver lowered the window and said, "He's ready." I didn't ask who he was, I didn't need to. I just walked ahead of the car to the south wing like before. Same path, same silence. Not even the crickets sang. When we reached Lot 0, they opened the trunk. Inside was another coffin, identical to the last. Same wood, same lack of weight. I helped carry it down. The dirt gave way easily, like it had never been disturbed since the first time. They didn't say a word during the burial, just watched. When the last shovel of earth covered the coffin, the woman approached, held out her hand, and gave me an envelope. Same as before. My name handwritten. No sender, no stamp. They left in silence. The gate closed. I went home shaking. My hands sweated like a kid's. I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 things, a photograph and a sheet of paper. The photograph was old, black and white. It showed the cemetery from above like a blueprint. In the bottom corner were 7 numbered graves, lots 11 to 17, and an 8th grave, freshly penciled in, marked as 18. On the paper, 1 line. Now the cycle begins again. In 15 years, another will come. The next morning, I checked the grave. It was there with the same iron nail at the top, but now with a small metal plaque, no name, just the word, waiting. I went to the parish's old records, asked to see the Wallach family files. The priest, a new young guy fresh to town, said there were no records under that name. Not in the 19th century, not in the 20th. When I pressed, he gave an uneasy smile and said, "Mr. Holden, we don't have anything like that here. I don't know who told you that story." I asked about the previous priest, the one who'd shown me the books. He hesitated, then said, "You must be mistaken. This parish hasn't had a priest before me in the last 30 years. I heard it was closed for a while. We only reopened in September." I returned to the cemetery, walked to Lot 18, sat on the stone bench facing the nameless headstone, and waited. And for the first time in decades, I felt I was exactly where I was supposed to be, because whatever was buried there twice is still waiting for the third, and I'm the only one who remembers. Story 4. My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 63 years old and live in a small wooden house next to the cemetery I've tended since 1986. It's in a tiny Minnesota town, the kind that barely shows up on maps, where everyone knows each other by their first name. I was a mechanic before, but when my father died, he was a gravedigger too. I took his place. They say some jobs choose you, not the other way around. Over time, I came to accept that. I've buried all sorts: soldiers, pastors, nameless folks, children, even a taxidermied bear once. But what happened one Tuesday in October made me rethink everything I thought I knew about death. It was a cold morning, the kind where the sky looks drained of color. A body arrived from the state hospital, sent directly by the funeral home in the next town. Not unusual. Sometimes unidentified bodies were sent for free burial in our municipal plot. No wake, no flowers, just a folded paper with a name and date. The truck arrived on time. The driver said nothing, just signed the delivery and handed me an envelope with the paperwork. I opened it right there at the administration desk. Name of the deceased, Marcus H. Poe. Estimated age, 47. Cause of death, sudden heart attack. The body was embalmed, no further prep needed. The hospital noted he was indigent. No one to claim him, no one to visit. A cold note at the bottom of the form: destination, municipal lot, north wing. I went to the truck with my gurney. The coffin was simple, darkened pine. But when I opened it, something stopped me cold. It wasn't death. I knew death well. It was the face. The man was too clean. His beard was perfectly trimmed, like he'd just left a barber shop. His hair neatly combed. His skin looked alive. There was color, a faint rosy hue. Not the artificial tint of formaldehyde, but something I'd never seen before. And the eyes, those half-open eyes. They weren't closed like others. They were caught, as if frozen in the moment of looking at someone. And they weren't empty. They were focused. For a moment, I thought it was my imagination, that I was too tired. But as I pulled the lid to close it, I had the distinct feeling that those eyes were locked on me, not following me, waiting for me, as if this man had something to say, something that for some reason I wasn't supposed to hear. I buried the coffin that same day, went alone to the north wing. The grave was already dug from the previous weekend. I lowered the coffin slowly, sealed it with crossboards, shoveled dirt, leveled it with the spade. I did it as I always had, methodical, respectful. When I finished, I staked the plot number and left, but something didn't leave with me. A strange feeling lingered, like someone was still watching, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, I couldn't shake the sense that burial wasn't finished. That night I dreamed of his face. It wasn't a nightmare, no blood, no screams, no death, just him, standing by the open grave, looking at me like I was late. He didn't speak, but his eyes, they demanded something. Not fear, not anger, more like a cold recognition, a silent certainty that our paths would cross again. I woke with cold sweat on my back, drank water, took deep breaths, tried to forget. After all, he was just an indigent. No family, no history, no destination. Buried like hundreds before him, or so I thought at the time. Exactly 7 days later, at the same morning hour, the funeral truck returned. Same model, same driver. The only difference was the weather. That Tuesday, the sky was overcast, threatening heavy rain. The driver didn't even get out, just honked twice as if he knew I'd be ready. I found it odd. No burial was scheduled that week, but I figured it could be another unlisted case, like when the hospital rushes a body due to lack of morgue space. I signed the paper he handed me without asking much, but when I got to the gurney and saw the coffin, a chill hit my stomach. Same model, same darkened pine, same serial number in the bottom corner, and the weight identical. But what floored me was when I opened it. There he was, Marcus H. Poe. The same face, the same perfectly trimmed beard, the same neatly combed hair as if time hadn't passed, the same almost living pallor, and the eyes an open a bit wider than the week before, no longer just half closed. They were steady, fixed, staring at the coffin's ceiling with unsettling clarity, sharper, deeper, moist. I stumbled back a step, nearly dropped the lid, checked the form. Same name, same death certificate number, same hospital, and one impossible detail: the date of death was the same as the week before. Same day, same time, same everything. I went back to the office, searched the records. Marcus Poe's burial was logged from the previous week, signed, documented, assigned to North Wing, Grave 47. I went there alone, dug with my hands. The dirt was firm, packed as it should be after 7 days, untouched. When I carefully opened the top, the crossboards were still in place, and I knew he was still there, or at least something was. I returned, looked at the new coffin, looked at the body, touched his chest just to confirm. Cold, hard, dead, but different, not like the others, like he was pretending, like something was waiting inside, daring me to get closer. I buried him again. Same place, same process, but this time my heart was heavy. I started keeping a separate notebook. Something told me this wouldn't stop here. That night, I sat on the porch with a glass of bourbon and a question that burned worse than the liquor. If he was already buried, how could he come back? The next day, I called the state hospital, spoke to the person handling indigent cases, asked if they'd recently released Marcus H. Poe's body. She checked the records and after a minute of silence said, "That name doesn't show up here. No entry, no death, no transfer." I asked her to check the death certificate number. She typed, paused, and said, "Sir, that number was closed out in 1987. I froze, hung up without saying goodbye. In 1987, I was starting as a gravedigger. It was the year I buried my first indigent. The name, Marcus Poe. I opened my old logbook, flipped to 87. There he was. Same handwriting, same number, same face, and the headstone had been removed years later by municipal order for lack of verified identification. I stared at that page like it would spit out answers, like it would suddenly make sense. But I just got more lost. I started questioning everything: the hospital, lying; the funeral home, evasive or complicit; the records, incomplete, erased; the truck driver, never saw him outside delivery hours; and Marcus Poe kept coming back, burial after burial every Tuesday. Same look, each time more alive. The following weeks were the worst of my life, not for what I saw, but for what I started to accept. Suspecting something strange is one thing. Living it regularly and realizing nothing you do changes it is another. Marcus Poe returned the third Tuesday, and the fourth, and the fifth, always with the same truck, the same silent driver, the same pine coffin, not a scratch on it, the same form with the same date, the same death, the same name, and the same look. But each week, he was more present. What were once half-closed eyes became wide pupils, moist, lips less tense, skin less cold. It wasn't exactly like he was coming back to life, like in the movies. It was worse. It was like he'd never left it, like he was pretending for me, testing how long I could keep up the charade. On the third week, I broke protocol. I poured concrete into the grave. After covering the coffin, I mixed cement with gravel and filled it like laying a house foundation. It took hours, nearly threw out my back. But by late afternoon, when the last shovel dried, I breathed easier. It wasn't official, of course, but no one checked the indigent plots, and if he came back, at least he couldn't get out. The next Tuesday, the truck arrived. Same driver, same coffin. I opened it with shaking hands. There he was, not a speck of concrete dust on his clothes, the suit clean, his skin with a faint warmth like he'd slept in the sun, and the eyes open. This time I couldn't deny it. They followed me. For a brief moment as the lid rose, I saw it. The eyeball moved. The iris found me and blinked. Just once, I nearly dropped the coffin. That night I tried to burn the body. I waited until everyone left, took the coffin to the old crematorium in the West Wing, out of use for years, but with a working furnace. It was forbidden. But this was no longer about rules. It was about ending what wouldn't end. I placed the coffin, started the system. The flames roared. The heat rose. I waited 40 minutes. The smell filled the room. Everything seemed right. When I opened the furnace, what I saw brought me to my knees. The coffin was intact. No marks, no smoke, no ash. And Marcus Poe, with his eyes wide open, like all that heat had only woken him up better. From that night on, I stopped trying to understand. I started documenting. I noted every burial, every date, every change in his eyes, his expression, the texture of his skin. I noticed patterns. On rainy Tuesdays, he seemed more still. On sunny days, his face looked more flushed. On days I prayed, not buried before the burial, he closed his eyes, but only for a while. Then they'd open again. I dug deeper holes, used lead plates, tried injecting acid into the coffin before burying. Nothing worked. And the worst part? No one else seemed to notice. The new funeral home assistant was too young to catch details, and the forms, always the same, printed on aged paper, like they were hiding the repetition in the texture. I even wrote to the local paper, under a pseudonym. No response. A week later, the article was removed from their site. My computer crashed for days. When it came back, the only folder missing was the one with Marcus Poe's photos, if that was even his name. I started doubting reality itself. The only constant was him, and the growing certainty that if someone was being buried every week, it wasn't him, it was me. I don't remember exactly when I stopped sleeping well, maybe the 5th or 6th week. The nights grew heavy, not from fear. Fear is what you feel when you're still sure what's real. What I felt was worse, like the world was folding in on itself, like I was the only one who knew something was wrong. But the rest of the universe had agreed to pretend everything was fine. The dreams came first. Dreams of the coffin opening on its own, of eyes that no longer blinked, but led me to graves that didn't exist. Not yet. Then came the voices. At first, like a distant echo, like wind in tall grass. Then clearer, whispered against my bedroom window at exactly 3:17 a.m. Always the same time. Not full words, just disjointed syllables, but they always started with the sound of something opening. And then came the photos. My father was a gravedigger before me. We inherited the trade like a silent debt. He kept boxes of burial records from the 1950s, albums by decade, files by name, handwritten dates, black and white photos taken with the old Polaroid he carried to the end. I never paid them much mind, but one sleepless night I opened the boxes, just to distract myself. That's when I saw the impossible. A photo from 1961, showing my father beside a simple, freshly buried coffin. The face was the same. Not my father's, the other one, Marcus H. Poe. Same haircut, same thin nose, same trimmed beard, same look. I froze, thought it was a coincidence, a similar face. But then I found others. 1974, 1987, 1995, 2003, 2011. Burials on different days, different cemeteries, but always the same man. In different poses, different coffins, different names, but the same look, the same damned look. And the worst part, in 2 photos, he wasn't in the coffin. He was standing beside it, at other burials, watching, blending in, witnessing. In my father's notes, I found a handwritten phrase, repeated on 3 pages across distant dates. He returns, he waits, he chooses. I went back to the state hospital the next weekend, trying again to ask about Marcus Poe's records. Went in person, spoke to a woman in the archives department. When I mentioned the name, she looked away, stayed silent for nearly a minute and said, "That name shouldn't be spoken in this building." Then she asked me to leave, said someone would call. No one did. I started avoiding mirrors because I began seeing things behind me. Not shadows, not shapes, reflections of eyes, open, still, staring at me like they were inside the glass. And deep down, I knew they weren't just eyes. They were his. Every Tuesday he came back, but now he wasn't just coming to be buried, he was coming to remind me. Remind me of what exactly? I still don't know, but I started noticing something that chilled me to my core. The more time I spent near the body, the more I forgot myself. Small things at first, where I left my keys, what day it was, then names, dates, my daughter's age, my wife's face, gone 5 years, started fading from memory like a photo left in the sun. And then a question hit me that stole my breath. What if he's not trying to scare me? What if he's trying to replace me? On the 13th week, I woke with aching knees and dry eyes. I'd fallen asleep on the porch armchair, boots still caked with dirt. The bourbon glass tipped over on the floor, empty. My watch read 5:12 a.m., but the sun was already hitting the cemetery's iron gate. I tried to stand and felt an odd pressure on my neck, like someone had been watching me for hours. I looked around. Everything was quiet. The grass swayed slightly, but the silence wasn't normal, it was trapped. I went straight to the records room and checked the notebook where I logged Marcus Poe's burials. The page for that week was already filled, but not in my handwriting. The date was there, the time, the lot. But the name in the identified as field had changed. It read, Walter Hensley, my name. I stopped, looked again. The pen was the same, but the handwriting wasn't mine. Her different curve to the W, a harder stroke on the Y. I went to the listed lot, West Wing Grave 23, a grave unopened for years, marked as reserved in the file. I never knew for whom. I started digging, barehanded. The dirt was loose, like someone had already started. And then I saw it. The coffin. Same as always. Same pine. Same serial number. Same darkened brass latch. I opened it, and there he was. But this time, it wasn't Marcus Poe. It was me. The body wore my clothes. My faded green jacket, the wedding ring on the left hand, a small scar on the eyebrow exactly where I'd hit my head in '98 during a botched exhumation, and the face, my face, but calmer, like it knew something I didn't yet. I stepped back. The coffin lid fell on its own. The sound echoed like a final bell. I looked around. The trees were still, the air heavy, and then I felt the shovel in my hand, but I didn't remember picking it up. And in front of me, standing, was a man. Same face, same suit, same serene look. The eyes, wider than ever, but now empty, like they'd served their purpose, like they were saying, "Now it's you." He didn't speak, just stepped back slowly and vanished among the graves. The next week, the truck didn't come. No delivery, no one called. But even so, on Tuesday at exactly 9 a.m., I was there, shovel in hand, at grave 23, waiting and waiting and waiting, but no one came. And then I understood. The cycle wasn't about burying him. It was about preparing my own ground. I was the last in line, and now all that was left was to repeat. The form was already filled out, the date set, the grave ready. I didn't need flowers or words, just the certainty that week after week, someone would see this face again, feel this gaze, and some other gravedigger someday would start to notice that death in the end has a memory, and it never forgets who dug the deepest.